What's going on, guys? So today, sorry, mic's a little loud. Hold up. Okay, a little bit better. Wait, hold on. Oh shit! Oh, turned the wrong one down that first time. Haha. All right. Anyway, so today I just want to play some Magic. Uh, yeah, we're gonna play some ranked. We're gonna watch some Lex Fridman, one of my favorite podcasters. Yeah, let's do it. I think. Let me see here. I think this time I'm doing ranked. I always play ranked, no matter what game. I'm a horrible person. I know. I play the shit out of Smite. Oh my god, I love Smite. But I've been playing it recently. I might play on stream at some point. Maybe tonight. Maybe tomorrow. Who knows? We'll see. But anyway, yeah. I love this. All right, let's do this. Let's see here. Let's do. I mean, my best deck I think right now is this one. It's pretty much a toxic deck with a couple additives in there and things like that. I do think I could probably slim this bad boy down. Like, I don't need that. I don't know. I've been seeing a couple things randomly in here that I'm like, yeah, I could use more of that. As I'm playing, you know. Anyway, whatever. So we'll play with this deck. You know what I mean? Alright, let's go ahead. This is Tulsi Gabbard, by the way, which I don't know if I'm a fan per se, but I respect Lex Fridman. I like I mean, people say he's a little soft. Yeah, probably. But you need people like that. And it's necessary to look at things that way sometimes. You know what I mean? Just a little bit more gentle than the rest of us or whatever. So let's see what she has to say.
It's a sad state of affairs when some of the most influential voices in our country will label someone a lover or supporter of dictators simply because you're saying, hey, we shouldn't be going to war. There is another way.
Cheers.
The following is a conversation with Tulsi Gabbard, who was a longtime Democrat, including being the vice chair of the Democratic National Committee. She endorsed Bernie in 2016 and Biden in 2020. She has been both loved and heavily criticized for her independent thinking and bold political stances, especially on topics of war and the military-industrial complex. She served in the U.S. military for many years, achieving the rank of lieutenant colonel. And now she is the author of a new book called For Love of Country. This is the Lex Fridman Podcast. To support it, please check out our sponsors in the description. And now, dear friends, here's Tulsi Gabbard. You've served in the U.S. military for many years, achieving rank of lieutenant colonel. You were deployed in Iraq in 2004 and 5, Kuwait in 2008 and 9. What lessons about life and about country have you learned from that experience of war?
So many. Central to those lessons learned was having my eyes open to the very real cost of war. of course, I served in a medical unit during that first deployment to Iraq. It was 2005 during the height of that war. And unfortunately, we took a lot of casualties. We, across the entire U.S. military, my brigade that I deployed with was from the Hawaii National Guard. We had approximately 3,000 soldiers who were operating in 4 different areas of Iraq. And my first task every day was to go through a list of every injury, combat-related injury that had occurred the day before in the country. And I went through that list name by name, looking to see if any one of our nearly 3,000 soldiers from Hawaii had been hurt in the line of duty. And then if seeing them on the list, tracking them down, where were they? Were they getting the care they needed? Would they be able to get sufficient care to stay in country and return to duty? Did I need to get them evacuated? Usually it would be to military hospitals that at that time were in Landstuhl and Ramstein in Germany. And then from there, getting them to either Brooke Army Medical Center, which is here in Texas, that specialized in burn-related injuries, or to Walter Reed, and tracking them and their care until they were finally home with their families. And it never became a routine task. It never became like, okay, cool, check the list, kind of dot the I's, cross the T's. It was that daily confrontation with the reality of the cost of war. Friends of mine were killed in combat. Experiencing firsthand that high human cost.
Oh yeah, my brother, by the way, I don't know if people
caused
know.
Me,
He's a Purple Heart
20-something-year-old from Hawaii. I had left my seat in the state legislature to volunteer.
Not that I think that that's like a fucking, I don't know, whatever. You know what I mean? But when people do this whole like sad sap thing, a lot of the time I sort of kind of tend to, I don't know. I don't want to say offended, but like, I don't know. Unless you're telling your story for like a real reason, then shut the fuck up. Like, whatever. Whatever. Maybe I'm a dick. Who knows? It's fine.
Volunteer to deploy with my brothers and sisters in my unit to Iraq. And so recognize the cost of war, I think, in 2 fundamental ways. Number one is the high human cost of war on our troops and on the people in the country where this war was being waged, and also the cost on American taxpayers. Seeing then back, again, 2005, and recognizing KBR Halliburton, one of the biggest defense contracting companies then, and I know that they are still very much in that business now. Dick Cheney being connected with that company at one point or another. But in our camp specifically, which was one of the larger ones in Iraq at that time, there wasn't anything that happened in our camp that didn't have the KBR Halliburton logo imprinted on it. We had a big shack-looking place where we ate our meals. They call it a dining facility, a DFAC in the military. And they served 4 meals a day. They brought in, and they being KBR Halliburton, they imported workers in from places like Nepal and Sri Lanka and the Philippines.
That's probably not the right move to make.
And work at this dining facility. I got curious about how much it costs us as taxpayers.
I knew it.
So I started asking around some people, and I think at that time it was like, well, every time a soldier or a service member walks through the door, if I were to go in for breakfast and grab a banana and walk out, that's an automatic $35.
Come on.
Per head, per meal, 4 times a day, thousands and thousands of people. And then we made friends. There's a pretty large Filipino community in Hawaii. A lot of Filipino soldiers from Hawaii. We made friends with the Filipino workers who were there. They would often go in like the back of the tents and set up their own like rice cookers and cook their own meals, which is where the real good food was. But just started talking to them and getting to know them and asked like, hey, how much do you get paid? And on average, it was like, I get paid like $500 a month. It's fine. $500 a month.
It's all good.
To go and do this work of either, cleaning out porta potties, picking up trash, the dining facility, doing laundry, all of these different tasks. Because the military wanted soldiers to be out doing things that only soldiers could do.
So
understandable. But when I started putting, two and two together and knowing that this company, one company alone, was making trillions of dollars.
I really want to go and throw this down, but then
and
I'd
yet
have to sacrifice that, and I don't
Filipino
wanna do
mom
that, so
is making $500 a month,
Wait, what
maybe
is
getting
this
one
when it
day
comes
off a
back?
week, maybe
Put
working
it
12
1,
hours a
2,
day
3,
otherwise.
4, 5,
I said, how often are you able to go home to your family? Well,
Maybe
they'll let us go
them
home a couple of weeks
try.
every other year. It was an eye-opening experience that growing up in Hawaii, I frankly hadn't given much thought to before. But it's what led me ultimately coming back from that first deployment. There was no way that I could go back to the life that I had left behind. And I knew somehow, some way,
that's what I thought.
I needed to find a way to use those experiences to try to make a positive impact, to try to influence those, frankly, the politicians who were making decisions to go and launch these regime change wars and send our men and women in uniform into war, and to what end, ultimately.
Hey, baby.
If we can just go back to that list.
Yeah.
So the list is just name and injury. Name and injury.
A little bit.
Name, unit,
Hey, baby.
potentially location, if someone had documented that, and their injury.
And it's just pages and pages of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I knew, I didn't get to call home every day, but when I called home and talked to my parents, I felt the tension in their voice. And, they didn't want me to worry about anything at home. And so they were always like, hey, how are you? What can we send you? And this and that. But, it wasn't like I was calling them from down the street and saying, hey, how's it going? Let's go have lunch or whatever. And so I knew that the reason for that tension was they were terrified of getting a phone call delivering the worst possible news. And that was what I thought of as I went through that list of how, it is the reality of war. Behind every one of those names on that list was, a husband or a wife, parents, sons and daughters, family members, who had no idea what we were dealing with, really. All they knew was what they saw on the news.
I'm so fucked. I'm so
fucked. What my dad told me later when I got home.
I'm so dead.
After that deployment,
this game is over.
Was that every time they saw the news and they saw a helicopter shot down or crash or some IED, they held their breath until they saw or heard the news of who it was or what it was.
What can you say about what the soldiers had to go through physically and psychologically when they get injured?
That doesn't bother me.
The physical, some injuries appeared to be minor up front.
Oh, fuck yeah.
At that time, traumatic brain injury was not something that was talked about much, if at all. And so, many had visible wounds. Others are now what we know appeared like, all right, cool, you checked out, but had invisible wounds. Those who were injured in a way that did not allow them to get back to work found it emotionally very difficult to be put on a plane and evacuated out of there, feeling guilty that they were leaving their friends behind, and not thinking about themselves, or not feeling bad for themselves, but instead feeling bad for being forced to be in a position to leave. For soldiers, it's not, of course, we all have our own political opinions on things, but when it comes right down to it, in a war zone, it's about your friends. It's about your brothers and sisters that you're serving alongside. It's not about the politicians or whatever insanity is going on in Washington. It's about getting up and going out, getting the job done, and coming back home together. I mean, I had friends of mine who were from Hawaii, who were from American Samoa, very culturally tight-knit community.
That might do a little bit. Okay.
Confided in me throughout that year that we were there. Some of the infantry soldiers who were going out on security patrols and doing raids every day. Just some of the very traumatic experiences that they went through.
GG's.
No physical injury.
That's fine.
but creating a kind of emotional stress and trauma that as human beings they were struggling in dealing with. On a positive note, you know, the Polynesian culture especially, but also Asian culture and other cultures around the world, our guys found that as they were, shortly after we got there, the unit that we were replacing, you know, we're taking the guys out on patrol and saying, hey, here's this village, here's where we found friendlies, or here's where we know that there are insurgents operating and they've got allies and lookouts, and, you know, showing them the lay of the land, basically. And what our guys found was that as they were doing these ride-alongs, they call it a left seat, right seat, when you're coming in and taking over, that there was a bit of a tense, even adversarial type of relationship, where on the military side, there was an assumption of suspicion or lack of trust, just with the local Iraqi people who lived around the base that we were at. And without anybody telling them to, culturally, our
like
guys
almost perfect
began trying to build relationships.
He can really fuck me if he. Oh
and,
my God!
You know,
can't.
For Hawaii and Samoa, and we had
he's
gonna
probably get rid of this at some point here in a
little
second.
Things like you're riding down in a Humvee, you've got a gunner in the turret with a 50 cal or a machine gun of some sort.
White.
Little things like pointing the muzzle to the sky as you're riding through a town, rather than pointing it directly at where people are walking down the street, was a huge gesture of an assumption of, hey, let's actually talk and become friends. We had our guys riding down the street and throwing shakas out to the local people there, breaking bread, sharing tea, and building those relationships. And again, I served in a medical unit, and what we saw was a downward shift in casualties from the unit that had been there before us, simply because of that basic human connection that our guys sought to make, and then gradually finding, like, hey, local, you know, people who lived in the town right next to us were saying, hey, you guys should really. Somebody was digging.
This is like a perfect
a mile
draw.
Down the road.
You
might want to bypass that or check
draw.
that out, and finding weapons caches.
I mean,
IEDs, improvised explosive devices, and other things that helped save people's lives.
On the cost side of things,
yeah, like, okay, cool.
How is it
that's
possible
fine.
for a company like Halliburton or others to get away with $40 bananas?
I'm sorry.
Much it was.
That was
the
perfect.
overhead
it was
costs.
Perfect.
Look, what they will
I couldn't
claim
have done
is that
wrong in
it's
that situation.
expensive to move logistics through a country at war.
It was good.
But they get away with it ultimately.
I really, you know what?
Insane.
I want to try this one.
This insane war profiteering, and they're not alone. Obviously, there are other companies that this is their business model. They get away with it because of their political connections,
the military-industrial
and
complex.
the lobbyists that they have,
cool.
the relationships they have with politicians.
It's a little different.
And ultimately, what President Eisenhower warned against with regard to that cozy relationship between Congress and even what he called then the military-industrial complex. It's been alive and well. He warned us against it, and I would say it's thriving more now than ever before.
How powerful is the military-industrial complex? As a thing, is it a machine that can be slowed down, can be stopped, can be reversed?
It can
we'll
be.
See.
It's powerful. I don't think you can overstate the powerful nature of it.
Yeah, let's do that.
Because it extends so deeply within our government.
If somebody attacks, I can use those.
It's not just those in these specific big defense contracting companies that benefit from it. You look at the revolving door within the Pentagon, for example, where you have both high-ranking people who wear military uniforms, as well as those who serve as high-ranking Department of Defense civilians who are literally working their way into a big payout when they leave that job. We see it with our own Secretary of Defense now. He retired as a general officer, went and served on
use that later.
one of the boards for one of the big defense
but
contractors, and then now back as
I'm here now,
the Secretary of Defense. We see the same thing in Congress with members of Congress and senior professional staffers in Congress. Same exact revolving door where you have people, whether they're writing contracts for the Department of Defense for the company that then wins the bid for that contract and then going and working for that company, or those in Congress who are writing policies and doing exactly the same thing.
You have been both a war hawk and a war dove at times. So what is your philosophy on when war is justified and when it is not?
War is justified when it is in the best interest of our national security, and when it is the last
this
resort.
Guy ain't doing nothing.
When all diplomatic efforts have been completed and exhausted, and war
and
is
the climb is on, boys.
The last possible route that must be taken to ensure the safety, security, and freedom of the American people.
So that's a high-level, beautiful ideal, but there's messy details. So terrorism, for example.
Yes.
The United States' involvement in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan was in part the big umbrella of the war on terrorism. So, you know, when you decide whether something's justified or not, and whether something can be defeated or not, how hard is it? Is it even possible? To what degree is it possible to defeat terrorism?
Well, first of all, there's part of the problem of our foreign policy has been how many conflicts, wars, military actions have been waged in the name of this quote-unquote war on terrorism, in the name of national security. Legislation like the Patriot Act that violates civil liberties, our civil liberties and freedoms in the name of the war on terrorism and national security when it's not justified. And so I'll use Afghanistan as an example. I support the initial mission that lifted off shortly after the attack on 9/11, the Islamist terrorist attack on 9/11. It was a relatively small group of U.S. military launched to go after those al-Qaeda cells and Osama bin Laden in the wake of that attack. That is the mission that should have been supported and focused on in its execution. Instead, as you know, attention was diverted very quickly to the regime change war in Iraq that was waged on false pretenses, and the resources and focus was taken away from that initial mission that went to Afghanistan.
I got this guy, but who knows?
And the war in Afghanistan blew up into something that became about regime change and governance and Taliban and less focus on Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, and it became this thing that even general officers had a hard time articulating. What is the objective here? What are we trying to accomplish? What does winning look like? At what point do we know it's time to exit and get out? And if you, as you look at things like the Afghanistan files and others, the answers to these simple and essential questions shifted and changed over time, over a very long time. Similarly in Iraq, I bought into a lot of what was being sold by the administration and by Democrats and Republicans and Congress at the time. And very quickly, even as I was on the ground there, started to have my eyes opened up into how we had been lied to tremendously, and how that protracted war went on for a very, very long time, with decisions being made that ultimately served to strengthen terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, the creation of ISIS and others, really undermining our national security interests in the meantime. Understanding the enemy that you are trying to defeat is essential to being able to build a strategy. The declaration of President Biden, for example,
that was a good
saying the war on terror is over. The war on terror is over. What does that mean?
That was great.
Or the forever wars are over. Well, what does that actually mean? I served on my most recent deployment in 2021 to East Africa and Somalia, where Al-Shabaab is one of those Islamist terrorist groups that follows the same ideology as Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hamas, and others. This group has been allowed to grow and be strengthened, even though they are one of the main groups that provides funding to Al-Qaeda in that entire region. So any president or politician can declare a war to be over. But when you have an enemy like these Islamist terrorist groups who are still intent on their goal and their objective, which is to ultimately establish their Islamic caliphate and, destroy Israel and exterminate the Jewish people and basically kill or convert anyone who doesn't adhere to their ideology. That continues on, and they will only become stronger the longer our leaders put their heads in the sand and pretend like, oh no, this doesn't exist. This kind of war, this war specifically, is one that has to be waged militarily and ideologically. And the ideological component to this, which is defeating their ideology with a superior one, is one that I pointed out in Congress during the Obama administration.
That was great. That was so good.
The collective we were failing at. The Obama administration was failing at because they were so afraid of being labeled Islamophobes that they refused to accurately identify the ideology driving these terrorist groups, and instead said, oh, we are countering violent extremism, was the term that the Obama administration started to use and was coined and kind of mandated across the U.S. government. Well, you have to know, again, the enemy that threatens you and why they're doing what they're doing if you have any hope of actually preventing their attack, both militarily and as we're seeing now with Hamas's actions, not only directly in the assault on Israel, but how Hamas achieved their objectives in spreading their ideology around the world.
If you look at the lessons learned from
I like that cover.
The U.S. involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq, how do you fight terrorism?
Clearly understanding who they are and where they are and why they're doing what they're doing is essential, first of all. And obviously there are different groups, different names. They have morphed and changed based on their locale and how they operate. Building relationships with people in other countries, both state leaders as well as religious leaders and others who share that same objective of defeating these Islamist terrorists on both fronts.
No, that's not the one I wanted.
And acting as a united front in taking that action. What exactly that action looks like, details on the ground dictate that. Details about these different groups will dictate that. But we've seen examples of this before, and I saw this in Somalia. We saw it in some cases in Iraq, where, for example, you have imams who recognize the threat that these terrorist groups pose to their own people and their own communities, and exerting their influence in defeating that the terrorist Islamist ideology with their own teachings of Islam and preaching peace amongst their people. War is ugly and it is messy. It is also an unfortunate reality of the world we live in. So while I firmly believe that we must always pursue peace, I'm not a pacifist. I'm a realist, and recognize that where there are these threats, we must do what we can to work towards that safety, that security, that freedom and peace that we all want.
If we look at the perspective of Israel in the Israel-Gaza war going on now, what do you do with the fact that the death of a civilian serves as a catalyst, gives birth to hate, potentially generational hate? So in Israel's stated goal of destroying Hamas, they are creating immeasurable hate. What do you do with that? From a perspective of Israel, what is the correct action to take in response to October 7th?
It's a complex question with a complex answer. I think Israel's approach has to be in recognizing that delineation as far as possible. And I know it's tough when you have a terrorist group like Hamas that is so interwoven within the community of people in Gaza. but to recognize that there should be and there is a shared purpose there for the Palestinian people to be able to live free and in peace and not under the oppression of this terrorist group, just as the people of Israel would like to live in peace and free from the threat of attack from a terrorist group that wants to exterminate them. The complexities of what's going on in Israeli politics is, I think, a different conversation, but also one that is directly intertwined with the answer to this question. When you have some people in the Israeli government who don't want the Palestinian people in Gaza at all and want them to go and repatriate in other countries, I think that's a big problem, and that further exacerbates this hatred and resentment that continues to grow there. This is a generations-long challenge, unfortunately, of the resentment and tension that exists between many Israelis and many Palestinians that can only be resolved when there's strong leadership representing both peoples who are able and willing to come together and recognize that the only way forward is to let the past be in the past and find a way towards peace in the future.
How do you hope the war in Ukraine will end?
The only way that this war ends is to do exactly what we're talking about. There has to be a brokered dialogue and conversation about peace that has to occur with representatives from Russia and Ukraine. It is really, truly heartbreaking to see both how efforts that began just weeks after Russia invaded Ukraine to do exactly this were thwarted by the Biden-Harris administration and other Western powers, has cost so many innocent people's lives. And this is where I have friends in Ukraine. I've been there more than a few times. I've enjoyed and appreciated the time that I've spent there. When I hear from my friends about,
I think I'm dead, guys.
How afraid they are of their husbands being conscripted.
I think you got me.
You know, feeling like they have to hide for fear of being yanked off the streets. Their friends and family members who've been killed in this war.
Yeah. Yep.
The only way this ends is when both sides come to the table and find an agreement that neither side is going to be completely happy with. Both sides being forced to make some concessions, but one where they will both walk away and this war can end.
What's the role of the U.S. president, perhaps, to bring everybody to the table? Do you think that the U.S. president should sit down with Zelensky and Putin together?
Yes. Yes, in an ideal world, yes. This should have happened long ago. The question of whether or not President Biden is the right person to do that at this time, when all of the statements and comments that they have made, the Biden-Harris administration has made from the beginning of this war, essentially point to their objective being to basically destroy Russia. And that's one of the reasons why they have supported both the continuation of this war for as long as it's lasted, as well as why they have thwarted efforts towards peace.
I don't think I'm going to win this, guys.
Whoever that most effective neutral broker is, that's the best person to do this. The Biden-Harris administration, I think the role that they have
ridiculous.
To take is actually encouraging Zelensky to sit down and begin this process. Those kinds of engagements are the most powerful exercises of diplomacy that can't be matched, especially when our president's foremost role and responsibility is to serve as commander-in-chief. And I wish that we had leaders who were more willing to engage, because I think we'd make a lot more progress more quickly, and to find areas both of mutual interest as well as to help deconflict and de-escalate areas where there is tension or disagreement or adversarial interests.
Well, some of it is basic human camaraderie. People call me naive for this, But sometimes just knowing that there's a human on the other side, even like when it's in private, if you look at Zelensky and Putin, for example, just humor. Both are very intelligent, witty, at times even funny people. Yes, this is wartime. Yes, a lot of civilians and soldiers are dying. There's hate. But if you can look above it all and think about the future of the countries, the flourishing of a people, and the stopping of the death of civilians and soldiers, then in that place you can have that basic human connection.
I agree. I don't think that's naive at all. And I think there are so many examples through history that point to the power of that, the real power in that. In, the Cuban Missile Crisis, how JFK had to literally find a secret way to communicate with Khrushchev to try to go around the backs of the military commanders who were urging him to take military action, and instead find, hey, we both ultimately want the same thing. Neither of us wants to launch a catastrophic nuclear war, so let's figure this out.
Of course, there's examples throughout history. Leaders are complicated people. They're manipulative people. So you have like Hitler and Chamberlain meeting, and Chamberlain kind of getting hoodwinked by Hitler's charisma and being convinced that Hitler doesn't have any interest in invading and destroying the rest of the world. So, you have to...
Smart. Don't be hoodwinked.
You've been criticized for this. You've met with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. And as part of the campaign, running for president, got criticized for not calling him a war criminal. What's the right way to meet and communicate with these kinds of leaders?
We, as I just stated, we need leaders who have the courage to meet not just with allies, but with adversaries in the pursuit of peace, in the pursuit of increased understanding. If policies are being made through the lenses and the barriers of bureaucrats and the media and others who have or may have their own interests, our president, a leader, can't make, even members of Congress can't make decisions with the kind of clarity that we, the American people, need them to make. I think that these kinds of engagements are weaponized and politicized as they were against me by those who have their own interests, whether it be the military-industrial complex or in Washington. If you're not part of the official narrative of the U.S. government, which was intent on a regime change war in Syria,
you know what?
then you're an outcast. And it was unfortunate because people levied all kinds of accusations and smears against me for going and having the audacity to go and learn more, try to seek the truth in the hopes of preventing more needless war and in the hopes of preventing yet another quagmire and disastrous war in the Middle East. And simply foregoing and, yes, meeting with Assad, also meeting with religious leaders in Syria, also meeting and talking with people on the streets of Damascus, talking with college students, talking with people from the opposition party who would like to see Assad replaced, talking with local law, just a whole host of people over the course of a few days. The accusation was levied like, oh, she loves dictators. It's a sad state of affairs when some of the most influential voices in our country will label someone a lover or supporter of dictators simply because you're saying, hey, we shouldn't be going to war. There is another way. And I'm not alone in this. People who were against the war in Iraq were given similar labels until it became, popular in our politics to have been against the Iraq war. We see the same thing now with people like Tucker, myself, and others who are saying we should not be waging this proxy war against Russia via Ukraine and using the Ukrainian people's lives in this war. Well, now all of a sudden you're a Putin lover, or a Putin puppet, or whatever, the traitor, treason, all of these accusations that are used ultimately by people who
I don't know what it is
are
about
not
me,
interested in
but,
having a
it's
substantive
ranked,
conversation about the truth, about looking at these wars and conflicts, with a comprehensive view on exactly all the dynamics that are at play. And that's what I found when I came back. I went to Syria looking forward to coming back and shedding light on different perspectives, experiences, and stories that I found that would give people a more broad understanding of what was happening in that country. And what I found was there was zero interest in the mainstream media or in Congress in hearing any other perspective other than their own, which was, we need to launch this regime change war through the use of arming and equipping known terrorists within Syria to overthrow the regime, without any idea, without them stating any realistic idea of who would take control once Assad was overthrown. But the reality actually being that no matter which opposition group they might try to prop up, they would not have the power to withstand the terrorist groups whose stated goal it was to go and take over power from Assad. They had no interest in trying to gain true understanding. And it was very disheartening. It was very disheartening, and a big lesson learned about where their interests really were focused.
Yeah, it's a simplistic narrative template that's fit into every single situation. A lot of stuff is not talked about in the Russia-Ukraine war. One of the things that's not talked about is, okay, so Putin is overthrown, then who do you think will come into power?
Exactly.
And one of the things I talk about with Arestovich is that Putin, and he gets criticized for this, that Putin, out of all the people that might take power, is the most liberal, is the most dovish. In fact, every indication shows that he really hates this war. And so everybody that will step in, if he steps down or if he is overthrown, is just going to accelerate this war and the expansionism and the thirst for empire and all that kind of stuff that the U.S. military industrial complex will feed into. So you have to think about what the future holds and what the different power players are and what the level of corruption there is, and sort of the realistic view of the situation versus the idealistic view of the situation.
Just on that note real quick, I think that was exposed in broad daylight when it appeared that, the former head of the Wagner group was about to try to launch a coup, and how that was so celebrated even on, like MSNBC and Rachel Maddow and others touting that this was somehow going to be a great thing, without looking at, who is this guy really? What has he been doing in different countries around the world, and what would be his kind of ruling philosophy, and how that would differ or benefit American interests or the interests of security and peace.
But also the interests of Ukraine and Russia and humanity overall. Just the flourishing of nations is just great for everybody in collaboration. Friendly competition, one of the things I love about the 20th century is the friendly, sometimes not so friendly competition between the Soviet Union and the United States in the space race. It's created some incredible engineering and scientific breakthroughs and all of this, and also made people dream about like reaching out to the stars.
Yeah.
War destroys all of that, or damages it. Hopefully just damages it. Hopefully the phoenix will rise again. So let me ask you about the criticism you've mentioned. It's probably the most common criticism of you that you love Putin. So just to linger on that, what do you think is the foundation of this?
That was good.
I'll tell you when it began.
That was fair.
I had
He killed me on
my
that
first day in Congress was January 3rd, 2013. I believe it was the 3rd, 4th, 5th, somewhere around there. And my last day was January 3rd, 2021. I had been given my experience of serving as a soldier in the Middle East, and the motivation that really drove me to run for Congress in the first place. I served on the Foreign Affairs Committee, Services Committee for almost 8 years. The 8 years that I was there, with my drive and motivation to actually be in a position to challenge the influence of the military-industrial complex, to try to prevent us from needlessly going to war. And so, the likes of Hillary Clinton and the cabal of warmongers in Washington, they weren't fans of mine, to say the least.
I hate fighting that dude.
I can't say it was a total surprise, but it was disheartening nonetheless that the very day that I announced my candidacy, that I was running for president, which was in February 2019, the hour that I walked up onto that stage to announce my candidacy, it was in Hawaii, and I gave my announcement speech. NBC News published a hit piece that planted the seeds of suspicion in voters' minds that somehow I was a darling of Putin and Russia and whatever. It was baseless, all of it baseless. And that continued like a steady drumbeat throughout my candidacy, but that really was escalated when in a podcast with David Axelrod, Hillary Clinton said, oh, well, the Russians are grooming her. And this is not... this came from a very influential person.
Yeah.
She was the former Secretary of State, former U.S. Senator, former First Lady, someone who wielded and continues to wield a lot of power in the Democratic Party and amongst voters. And that took it to a whole new level. What is the basis for this? Nothing. It is a tired yet dependable playbook that is used not only by people like Hillary Clinton, but also people like Mitt Romney and others to try to smear, discredit, and destroy the reputations of people who have the audacity to question their objectives, as they call for war or another, or have the audacity to say that this is not in the best interest of peace or in our country and our national security. They keep going back to this playbook, as they do today, because, again, they're not willing to debate the substance of one position versus another, which is what we should have. People feel so strongly that we should be going and waging this war, that war. Okay, great. Go make your case to the American people. Go stand on the floor of the United States House and actually have this debate. Allow those who are saying, no, this is not a good idea, to also stand freely and make that argument. Instead, they resort to the kind of name-calling that tells voters, hey, you can't trust this person for anything that they say. Myself and some of my other colleagues got the same treatment when we tried to pass legislation in Congress that would have taken out provisions from the Patriot Act that are most egregiously violating our Fourth Amendment rights and civil liberties. Authorities that have allowed our government to illegally surveil Americans without a warrant. And as we did so, we're called traitors. We were called, we had other members of Congress on the House floor saying that if you pass this legislation, you will be responsible for another 9/11 style attack on our soil. These are all distraction tactics to try to divert our attention away from what's actually happening, and instead just tell voters, hey, you can't trust these people. Obviously, this has happened to Trump, Bobby Kennedy. It's happened to people like Rand Paul and others. There's a small group, but a growing number, at least on the Republican side at this point, people who are actually willing to stand up and challenge the military-industrial complex, challenge the warmongers in both parties.
Well, people on the left have challenged the warmongers as well throughout the last few decades.
Less so recently. I agree with you. Less so recently, and this is one of the reasons why I left the Democratic Party. One of the foremost reasons. I devote an entire chapter to this issue in my book, for love of country, leave the Democrat Party behind, going into the detail of some of the things that we talked about my own experiences, about what I have learned along the way, but also how, you know, even in the last year, 2 years, certainly under this administration, people who I worked with in Congress who were Democrats, dependable voices for civil liberties, dependable voices speaking out against the insanity of people who wanted to wage war for the sake of war.
I think I'm done for the night. I will see you tomorrow.
They're largely silent now.
Love you.